Here we come. We are going. We're going in now. We're heading in. This is it. Whole new year. Happy New Year, everybody. And of course, for me, the most important feature of a new year is a new cycle through the Torah. And so Genesis, Bereshit, really like it's a little bit like being in a wonderland, you know, like when you're back in Genesis, it's like, oh my goodness, it's like, and we're only going to be here for 1 week, and it's like the most special, the most sacred of all the parshas. Okay, so let's see, a couple of introductory things. First of all, I would love to know, I'm posting these classes on Facebook every morning of, just like, hey, we're having, did anyone see that? Raise your hand if you saw that, and that's part of why you're here. Okay, so it does help. Okay, good. That's good. That's good to know. Okay. Here's what we're going to do. I want to just kind of give us a little bit of a one word of introduction about our trajectory for the year, for the semester, for this like stretch of learning, this cycle of learning. And I want like I would say that like with a little self-promotion, because I have a book coming out this fall, and it should have been out by now, but I keep dragging my heels. You know, COVID, everything's late and it's fine. But I have a book coming out this fall, and the book is on Parshanut, which is a Torah commentary. And I feel like, I teach a weekly like Parsha class. I should like promote the book in some way. I should like, you know, be hyping the book up. But I don't want to like teach the book. That's, you know, they're essays and that's boring. And I also just don't like teaching anything twice. But I do want, in honor of this book that's coming out, to teach this year differently than we were doing last year. Last year we primarily focused on the text of the Torah itself, just the text, just the pshat, or just the words themselves. Pshat is a complicated term that we're soon going to encounter again. But just like, let's just look at the wonder of this piece of literature, of this book which sparkles with divinity. Let's just look at how it communicates to us. And that's the way that I have been most enjoying learning Torah in recent years. But my first love and my first sort of where I really took off into Torah study was with Parshanut, which is the tradition of commentary upon the Torah, which starts, the one that we've inherited starts in the rabbinic period alongside the Talmud and stretches on through to the present day. And I would say, you know, Aviva Zornberg is maybe the greatest figure in Parshanut today, the real, like someone who is becoming part of the canon. There are a couple others, but she really stands out. But okay, so it's a topic I have been completely seized by and wrote a blog on for 5 years, and I'm trying to turn that now into a book, if I can just like get it out the door. But okay, so with all that said, this is a passion of mine, and it's also a very fundamental, classic, and important way of studying the Torah. Different than we did last year, which is to look at the Torah through the lens of its tradition of commentary. And what have other people asked and said in response to their questions on the Torah? And what do we learn? Well, it's a way of layering the text of the Torah itself, but it's also, I think, a way of learning about Jews, like Jews throughout history. And sometimes not just Jews, you know, other Christians and other commentators on this text, which has so captured the world's imagination. Okay, so I don't want to do too much more fanfare and introduction here, and I may repeat some of this next week because I want to like send out an email kind of promoting the classes for this year. But we have to start today. There's a very obvious place to start today, and if we're starting this project, and that is we have to start with Rashi. And Rashi's the one. Rashi's the name. Rashi is the name the way that Shakespeare is the name in English. he's just like, he's the legend. But Rashi is different than Shakespeare because Shakespeare wrote things where Rashi compiled things. The great genius of the great geniuses of the Middle Ages are known, the Rashi and Maimonides are known actually in tradition more for their collections of previous ideas, perfect collections of previous ideas, than they are for their own sort of like completely original. But as you'll see in any compilation is an interpretation, and any kind of collection is a kind of a creative project itself. So we'll learn a lot about Rashi, but I just mean to say that what Rashi did was looked back at all of the rabbinic commentary that preceded him, that commentary that started in the 2nd and 3rd century alongside the Talmud, and then just sort of took it, put it all in his head, and gave us tidbits that would help us do this new thing, which is to follow the text of the Torah with a running commentary, with a running voice in our heads. Right? The Midrash was not organized in that way. The earlier traditional commentary was just like, here's another idea, here's another idea, here's another. But Rashi edited it so that little like wisdom from the Midrash or little suggestions from the tradition could be woven in as a consistent narrative throughout the Torah. Now, Rashi, the other thing that, well, let's just say a bit about who he was. He was a rabbi in France in the 11th century, 1000s, right? And, I'm not much of a biography person, not a historical mind. People like to talk about the fact that he was a vintner, that he had like wine, Rashi made wine. There's a company, Rashi Wines now. But that's, okay, so he made a living. But most of his time was spent as a rabbi in yeshiva, and he was really part of a yeshiva culture. Went to study in a famous yeshiva in Worms in Germany. It's like sort of France-Germany region, and that's important. It's important to know that he's really his approach to the Torah will be: can we see this through the lens of the Talmud and the Midrash and the rabbinic tradition that that is now forming a culture of study? And he was deep in that. He's not like, there are other commentators who are kind of more sole independent thinkers, but Rashi was really immersed in Jewish learning culture. And the other thing that I want to say, just by way of context, is that will be important for our piece today, that what we're looking at today, is that Rashi, sometimes we speak about golden ages and bad times in Europe for the Jews. Did this Jew happen to live in with relative peace and harmony with the surrounding non-Jewish culture, or was it an era of persecution? And with Rashi, it's I think somewhere in between. I mean, Rashi lived and thrived and had a business, right, for a long time, but also later in his life lost many people that he had studied with to crusades that would sort of sweep through, in this case, northern Germany. And I think that Rashi lived with a certain amount of not abject persecution, but an awareness that it could come at any moment and you could be just annihilated. Total insecurity around his relationships with, but he clearly spoke the local language, references it often, and talks sometimes about even interactions with local, like he lived in a non-Jewish society, but I think always on edge, always a little insecure. Okay, but enough about bio. Let's turn to see what he does. And we're going to look at the first Rashi in the Torah. And that this is a piece which, well, he actually gives us three pieces on the first verse in the Torah. So we're just like, open the first verse. What does Rashi start telling us? And the piece that Rashi starts with is one that, in some ways, it's like, oh no, that's the first Rashi, because as you'll read it, I suspect that many of you will feel like this is absurd. And I suspect that some of you will feel like this is offensive. So we'll take that into account, but we'll go slowly, and whatever it is, we're going to learn a lot about who Rashi is and what mattered to him just by seeing how he introduced. Rashi has no introduction to his commentary on the Torah, which almost everyone else does. That's like a classic hakdamot. Introductions are like almost a form of literature unto themselves. Rashi is mum, so this serves as a kind of an introduction, and I think actually the more you look at it, the more we sensitize ourselves to who is the man behind the commentary, the more we sensitize ourselves to Rashi, the more I think we'll start to see how sensitive Rashi is, and even the sort of the unpleasant. I mean, we're never going to make Rashi modern, but I think we'll start to see that he was complex and thoughtful and sophisticated, undoubtedly sophisticated, but also sensitive. Okay, so let's dive in with that said. Now I want to do, before we go into Rashi, I want to just show you I think one of the things that we should start to do is to get to know this website here as a learning community, and that is Sefaria. It's really, really important. It's becoming more and more important as the years roll on. It is like really the let's see. All right, I'm gonna first just type it into the chat. Okay, so take a look at. Oh, do I have to do HTTP to make it work? Can you do that for me, Jess?
Correct. Yep.
Yeah. So okay. So but now I'll just screen share and show you what it looks like. I almost want to just work from Safari, not to give you source sheets. I almost want to just do that, but in the end, I'm so picky about translate, so sensitive to the translations that I can't just totally rely on it. But it's just good to know. This is Sefaria, started by, when all us rabbis are forgotten, Brett Lockspeiser will be, of this generation, will be the Jew that is remembered for starting this thing. And he started actually with Joshua Foer, and this is how it works. You click to the menu, and here are texts that are available to you: Talmud, Halacha, Jewish law, Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. But we're just going to go to. It's going to be very easy for us. Tanakh, which is the word for the Hebrew Bible. Click in. Here it is. All the Hebrew Bible. Genesis. Click in. Right now we're just keeping it easy. But here's the really useful and critical piece here. We begin. First of all, you can have Hebrew and English, or Hebrew or English, or Hebrew and English, which we usually do here. And there's the first verse. And here's where Safari gets really exciting, is if you click on the first verse, there are resources, including 400 pieces of commentary. And in our case, it's going to also be easy, because if you click on that, the first one is going to be Rashi. Okay, so you click on Rashi, and now you have, here's in Hebrew, right? Here's in English, and you have access to Rashi. The whole thing is available translated online. I do not care for this particular translation, so we're not going to be using it today. Instead, we're going to be using a source sheet where I retranslated things. But it's still very, very valuable just to have this and to see it here. And Rashi on the next passage, Rashi on the next passage. Oh, there's no Rashi here, so we go to, okay. So it's very, 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 very important website just to have some facility with. Okay, now let me then give you the actual source sheet that we're going to use today, and then we'll read, and then finally, I will stop talking and let you get into a little analysis yourself. Okay, so here we go, I think. Yeah, here's the source sheet. You can copy and paste that, or Jess can turn it into a link. I don't know, I have to get better at that. HTTPS:// that kind of stuff. But there's your source sheet, and we're going to take a look at it together. And what I want to do is, well, let's actually, let's just look at the text itself, the opening verses of the Torah, and we're going to ask the question. It has become a famous question in the world of Jewish study. What's bothering Rashi? That's the question. What's bothering Rashi? And that question tells you a lot about the way Parshanut works in general, which is we always begin with a question. Something's not. It's a remarkable thing, actually, that we have this book that we consider to be like exquisite, immaculate, perfect, divine, and yet the way that Jews approach that book, that perfect book, is to say like, well, this looks weird, this looks off, this doesn't make any sense. That's our approach, and every Rashi is responding to, and hopefully every comment, every piece of commentary on the Torah is responding to some difficulty in the text, something that needs addressing. So let's just first look at the opening verses of the Torah, dun, 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 and I want to know first, before what's bothering Rashi, what's bothering you? What kind of questions do you have when you read the opening of the Torah? So let's just take a look here at the opening of the Torah and see what it says. This is my translation, okay? Okay, maybe we should because it's like so, maybe we should read it, chant it a little bit, right? Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz ve'haaretz hayta tohu vavohu ve'choshech al pnei tahom ve'ruach Elohim merachefet al pnei hamayim vayomer Elohim yor vayhi or vayar Elohim et haor ki tov ve'yavdel Elohim ben haor u'ben hachoshech Vayikra Elohim laor yom ulachoshech kara laila vayhi erev vayhi voker yom echad. In the beginning of God's creating heaven and earth, the earth was, that's my translation, the earth was chaos and void and darkness over the surface of the deep and a wind from God sweeping over the water. God said, let there be light, and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness God called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, a first day.
Rabbi?
Okay. All right, so let's hear it. There we just opened your most sacred text. This is it, the Torah. The Torah begins this way. Now, Rivka's going to start us off. Let's. That's not. Yeah, I'm gonna have to. Is that you? Okay.
I have muted everybody, so I don't know what happened.
Okay, we'll try it again. But Rivka, you can start us off. We'll just see if there's a. But the question is, what? Okay, you're reading this. What questions come up for you? What's bothering you? Rivka, can you give it a shot? No. Unfortunately, we can't hear you, I think.
I hope you can hear me. No.
Okay.
Nope.
Okay, let's try Yael. Yael, will you give it a shot? I'm sorry, Rivka.
Yes. One thing that bothers me about that translation is that you translated ruach into wind, and when you say wind, it means that Hashem is in one place and sends forth a wind, which is merachefet, which is going back and forth. But if you say the Spirit of God, merachefet, if the Spirit of God is going over the waters, it means that to me, it infers that God's self is transforming the waters.
Mm-hmm.
And so I like it better for my conception of, not that I can conceive of what's going on here, I really can't. But
Okay, great. Okay, so first of all, let me just add some thoughts. I won't. We're taking questions and concerns here, so I won't. But I want to explain some of what Yael is saying, because this, I contend, this is like the most difficult verse in the entire Torah, the second verse. Right? The earth was chaos and void, and darkness over the surface of the deep. And a wind from God. This, could be translated and has been translated as the Spirit of God or the Spirit of the Lord. You know, Christians like that translation because this is the Holy Spirit, right? But yeah, I mean, what is a wind from God makes it seem like God blew it, but it actually seems like the wind of God or the Spirit of God, right? It's very good. Okay, so some of the language there. All right, let's keep going. Noah.
Yeah, what's bothering me about this is that we're starting out and it seems like it's bringing in some mythological battle that's not written about, that there was chaos and darkness over the the deep, and that the light conquered that darkness, and then God saw that the light conquered it and it was good, so he said this will be day, this will be night, and then it doesn't mention the chaos for a long time afterwards. So it just seems to be leaving bits and pieces out from that translation.
Great. Yeah, again, what's going on there? The chaos and the void, and they seem to be there before God's creating? Or what are these primal? Okay, good. Yonatan.
I'm going to play a game of guess what Rabbi is thinking, and when I look at your translation, I think this is probably what you're going for. That the first three words in the Hebrew are a grammatic impossibility. Right? That Bereshit bara Elohim, there's no, like, we always translate it as in the beginning God created, but unless you have a preconceived notion of what Reshit is, those words actually don't add up to anything.
Very good. Okay, very good. I'm not fishing, by the way. I will just try to exonerate myself of that charge. But this is certainly one of the big problems here. Bereshit does not mean in the beginning. It's a word which, it's a funny word. You know, you could have said batchila or barosh, but Bereshit is an unusual word, and it seems to be a, what do you call it? Not a compound, but a, you know, when you're, smichut. In other words, in the beginning of this, right? So there's something like, what exactly? I tried to retain the famous in the beginning in the translation, but some people with this, presented with this difficulty, just throw that out and say, when God began to create the world, right? As opposed to in the beginning, God created the world. There's a lot about this grammar that doesn't make sense. And may I just add to that, that the grammar of God doesn't make sense, right? God is a plural, the verb is in singular. So it looks like in the beginning, God's creates. It's hard to say. In the beginning, God's created. But in the past in English, it doesn't make a difference. But in the past in Hebrew, it does. Okay, so grammar problems. Let's see, Wendy.
Actually, that was part of what my question was.
I'm sorry. As I was doing it, I felt I was doing it. I'm sorry.
Oh. And actually, that was part of my question, and it always is my question. Gods, and I think that when we're talking about Torah, it seems that everything is there for a purpose. So these are not, as Yonatan was talking about, these words that don't belong together, yet somewhere there's a reason that these words are chosen to begin, especially to begin the Torah. And that's my biggest question, because these are things that, as we were trying to logically figure it out, this particular parsha is void of logic as we know it as humans. And I think that maybe for me, that's one of the great powers of this, is that you really are introduced to the notion that everything that we know here on earth as a logical explanation for things, it's not. We're going beyond that.
Okay, wonderful. So here's what I'm going to do. I think this is such good, just to hear our response, that I want to keep it going. And I'm going to just take all the hands that are up. I really should be plowing forward now, but it's okay. We'll see as much of Rashi as we see, and we'll put it in conversation with our own questions. But let's just hear the rest of the hands are up. So I'm going to just call Joni, and then Elizabeth, and then Rachel, and then Payam, and then Jamie, and then we're going to see Rashi. Okay, so let's just take the hands out. Joni.
I love what you said, Wendy, and I think the plural of the gods is because there will be many names of gods coming in. So this is it. And so I have two things I wanted to ask, and just sort of like in the beginning, and what was before the beginning? What's our sense of where God was? And the second question that I really, it's like, and God created the light and it was good. So if it was good, why create the night? I'm just wondering about that. So thank you.
Great questions. Great questions. Elizabeth? Oh, can't hear you just yet.
I also loved what Wendy said. It was very similar to where I was going. So thank you for saying that. And I guess this is so poetic and so beautiful that I hate to say that anything bothers me, because there's something, it's a beautiful way to enter. But I guess if I had to say intellectually, what bothers me is that the whole thing is really set up to be anti-evolution, anti-atheism, anti-humanism, anti all kinds of philosophical ideas that we might want to explore. But if you believe this, this is all sort of in opposition to those truths. So it doesn't really bother me, because I love the poetry of this. I think it's a beautiful invitation to come in. But if there was something that intellectually doesn't fit with where I am as a person, as a scientist, it's that. It's the, that.
Okay, excellent. I want to just highlight that this is a different kind of question than we've heard so far. It's a little bit of a like, what is the Torah doing here? Noah sort of alluded to questions like that. Elizabeth is really asking, like, what is the Torah up to when she opens with these ideas? Like, there's statements being made. What are they and why are they being made? Okay, good. Let's see, Rachel.
So one thing that I can't read biblical or modern Hebrew, and the advantage that that sometimes has is when I'm like looking up words, I kind of end up doing my own thing with them. So I always read this, even though I don't think anyone else does, as because of the ruah having the root meaning of wind, I always see it as breath, just because it kind of like clicks with me. And so I love, and breath is literally life, and in yoga, pranayama is the life force, not just the idea of breathing, but like that our breath also animates us. And so that's sort of how I see it, neither kind of like wind or spirit, but just this really beautiful life force that I can literally relate to, because I and all of us alive have it as well. And then with the chaos, it to me, that just reflects like to the Big Bang, because even when I look at it from science, the Big Bang sounds very chaotic. I don't know that I would have wanted to be there. But I can't explain what happened before the Big Bang either, and I can't explain what happened before this. So it almost reminds me, like, while this is poetry and there's a lot of mythology, it really connects me to this idea of that science and faith don't have to butt heads, and that there's a lot in Genesis that like makes sense, like with the dust as like the primordial soup of where we came from. And I don't know, it's just, the second line is my favorite verse in the entire Torah. But anyways, now I'm just rambling. But yeah, that's sort of what I take from it.
Okay, beautiful, thank you. Payam, good to see you, Payam. Payam, who was so mysterious to us last cycle, is visible. It's like seeing right. Yeah, what is it that Jacob says? Seeing your face is like seeing the divine.
So yeah, I always had the weird ontological question of this, because it says God created heaven and earth. So where does God reside? It's like this weird, like, because we always assume he's in heaven, but he created heaven and earth. So it's like I just had that question of like, because we never even like, I don't know, I've never read into, or like, I know about the Sefirot and stuff, but like he created those too. So like, you know, like, where does God reside?
Yeah, great. I think we're in a good rhythm now. We're really starting to ask some a priori questions. Wait, what's the context here? Where are we even getting into this? Who is this figure, and where are we? When is this happening? Okay, one more thought. This has been really good to hear the collection of voices here, and we're soon going to hear Rashi in contrast to them. It'll be a nice point of contrast. Jamie, will you give us one last thought?
Yes, one last thought. Can you hear me over this lawnmower?
Yeah.
Okay. It's a funny thing because I've always sort of taken it for granted. You read this over and over again, and you hear Vayomer Elohim, Vahi or, yeah. And God said, "Let there be light," and then there was light. And I just think it's a wild proposition that there's a God that creates through speech. And
Right.
I just never feel, I think it's an odd thing. I think it's an odd thing in ancient cultures, as far as I know. And it's just a crazy thing to say because there's no precedent at all for a being creating anything for speech anywhere, through speech, anywhere. So it's quite the thing to say right at the beginning of this book, like speech is creation. So that's all.
I love that question. This is like a glaring, bizarre thing right in front and center. And the Torah just sort of presumes it. Do you want to explain anything about God? But like at least that God creates through speech, I want to say, because that's, yeah, a wild thing. And just like we're supposed to just read through and accept that as a concept. Okay. I love that question. I love all your questions. They're all great questions, and you can see how many of them emerge, and some of them echoed each other. But I have to say, nobody asked Rashi's question. And that's not because Rashi asked a better question, but because Rashi's question is quite surprising. So let's read Rashi and then try and let's start with what we do is we read Rashi and we go back and try and because Rashi never says, here's what's bothering me. Rashi just answers a question hovering in the air. So let's take a look and we'll try and figure out what's bothering Rashi and then eventually how Rashi tries to resolve that difficulty. Okay. So Rashi says, in the beginning, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, lo ya tzarich latchil et Torah ela me'achodesh hazeh lechem. Rabbi Isaac said, now you can already tell, Rabbi Isaac's a Talmudic figure. Rashi is quoting. Okay, Rabbi Isaac said, the Torah could have just started with the verse in Exodus. This month shall be unto you the first of the months of the year, the calendar, which is the first commandment given to Israel. What is the reason then that it commences with the account of the creation? So that's as close as Rashi gets to telling you his question, but I think we still need to figure out exactly what's bothering him. But let's just see what he answers. So what is the reason then that it commences with the account of creation? Because of the thought expressed in the text in Psalms, God declared to God's people the strength of God's works in order that God might give them the inheritance of the nations. For should the peoples of the world say to Israel, you are robbers, listimatem, because you took by force the lands of the 7 nations of Canaan, Israel may reply to them, all the earth belongs to the Holy One, who created it and gave it to whomever the Holy One pleased. When God willed, God gave it to them. And when God willed, God took it from them and gave it to us. That Rashi's borrowing from the Yalkut Shimoni, a Midrashic collection. Okay, I heard someone jumping in. Was that you, Lad?
Just where does Rabbi Yitzchak's opinion end? Where's the end quote for?
That's a great question. It's a great question. I think, I'm not sure the answer to that question, but it's a great question because Rashi does do this, like, let's see if we can go find it actually. Let's see, get in there. No, there's no link to it right here. There should be. But it is, I suspect, it's a great question that Lila's asking because Rashi, as he compiles, will sort of editorialize. So like, we're not sure which of these words are Rashi's and which ones are borrowed, but he is quoting from Rabbi Isaac. And that is, that is found in the earlier Midrash, but when Rashi adds something like, what is the reason then that it commences with the account of creation? That's Rashi stepping in to make the question clearer. And I suspect that Rashi may also have added the end piece, when God willed, God gave it to them, and when God willed, God took it from them. And like Rashi will embellish or editorialize the earlier source, though the question and the quote from Psalms surely, and the answer is from the Midrash. Lila, do you want to follow up on that at all, or is it just a point of clarification?
I'm wondering this generally, like how to read Rashi. So I figured I'd ask this very specific question. So
very good question. Very, very good question. And there are books, I love these, and I wish I had one in front of me, that will go through and they will tell you, like they'll select, this piece of Rashi is from, and you start to see why he's regarded as a genius. Because it's not just like, oh, he's just collecting earlier Midrashim, but this will be from one, and then this piece will be from another, and then this is just clearly just Rashi's words added in, right? So there is a complex kind of editorial process here that Rashi's going through, and so Lila's asking a really, really good question. Okay, what's bothering Rashi, right? What's Rashi's question here when Rashi begins by saying, the Torah could have started in Exodus chapter 12 with the commandment to start marking time by the moons, the new moon, right? So in some ways, Rashi tells us his question. Why do you need to start with this story about how the world was created? I mean, I said Rashi doesn't usually tell you Rashi's question, but in this case, pretty close, but I don't think that's enough. It's not just a question about why are we studying the creation story? It's a more specific question. So anyone want to try and speak that out for me? What is bothering Rashi? I see Jody has a thought.
If the Torah is there as a book of laws for the Jewish people, why start with this universal episode? Start with the law for the Jewish people. Great. And so, but clearly he, as any diaspora Jew is living among other people. And so he has to put the Torah, he wants the Torah to be in that context and within that dispute. Who are you? Where are you living? I mean, in fact, he's not living in the land of Israel, but this is very much defending the right of the Jews to claim it as their own.
Okay, Jody did, just thank you so much. Jody did such a lovely job of really getting to the heart of the concerns here. And first by just speaking out what's implicit here, which is that Rashi's first question presumes, let's go back, let's just see it on the screen here. Rashi's first question presumes that the Torah is first and foremost and fundamentally a book of law. Torah is a book of law. It's our law book. The reason we study the Torah is to know what to do. Why should the Torah, I mean, you want to skip the entire book of Genesis? The most beautiful thing ever written? You just want to skip that and head to not even the best part of Exodus. You want to head to when the Torah starts to get boring, when they start telling us like little, nitty gritty laws. But Rashi, it's a wild presumption that Rashi is making that Jody just spoke out, which is that this is a law book. And in fact, you know why I didn't use the other translation? Take a look at the translation here just speaks that out for us. Rabbi Isaac said the Torah, which is the law book of Israel, but that's not what Rashi says. But they speak it out to make the question even clearer, should have commenced with the verse, right? So that was a little too much translation for my taste. But we see it here because Rashi says clearly that was the first commandment. This is a book of commandments, of laws. Why are you telling me all about creation? And I just want to say, like, what nerve? How do you get away with saying, like, forget about like the heresy of dismissing Genesis. How about just like the intellectual crime of saying it's not important to think about where the world comes from? The only thing that matters to us Jews is like, what are the mitzvahs? What are the mitzvahs? Right? Like a wild thing to say. And then Jody begins to take us into some of the rationale, right? Which is that Rashi, I loved your language, Jody. Rashi's trying to contend with the universal nature of this story when Rashi lives in a very particularistic tradition and trying to think, well, the Torah doesn't start talking about Jews. Torah just starts talking about the world. Why? What is the Torah's concern? And then Jody starts to speak out the way it might trigger some of Rashi's own concerns. Okay. All right. So that's the what's bothering Rashi is why doesn't the Torah start with law? Okay. Now, what is Rashi's answer to the question? Why doesn't the Torah just give me mitzvah number 1, the moon, mitzvah number 2, right? What's Rashi's answer to the question? Let's just go back and read it again quickly so we see what Rashi says. Because of, and this is an interesting move, because it's just like what they say in the Psalms. In other words, here's a little proof text, which is that God declared to God's people the strength of God's works in order that God might give them the inheritance of the nation. But here's the real answer. Because if the people of the world say to Israel, you are robbers because you took by force the 7 nations of Canaan, Israel may, and this, by the way, in case you don't catch the reference, is what we are commanded to do in Deuteronomy. Head into the land of Israel and destroy the people that are there because they are idolaters, and God said, to do that. And if they say to you, you stole this land, you killed these people, then we can reply, all the earth belongs to the Holy One who created it and gave it to whomever the Holy One pleased. When God willed, God gave it to them. And when God willed, God took it from them and gave it to us. So that's the text that Rashi gives us. Can someone speak out for us? What's Rashi's answer to the question, why have a Genesis? Why have a creation story? Can someone speak that out? Matthew?
Hi. He's worried that people are going to be jealous of the Jews.
Good. Okay, that's part of it. Jealous of what, though?
Well, land, for example.
Okay, there's going to be some Rashi who is living in northern France, is concerned, right, in the 11th century, is concerned that the nations of the world will accuse Israel of stealing the land of Israel. It's like funny because it echoes in our ears in a certain way with like the political context of Israel. It's like no such thing in Rashi's time. So let's continue to develop this. What is Rashi's concern? I see hands up and I don't know which of the clicked hands are meaning to address this question. But I've seen hands up for a while, so maybe Lila.
I mean, I don't think you're going to like this, but I feel like Rashi is coming from this rabbinic tradition. And so like in many ways for Rashi, like the start of Judaism is like, I don't know, you talk about it, what is it, like the Deuteronomists or whatever, right? So he's identifying and he's pulling from all of these sources from like the beginning of the rabbinic or Talmudic tradition. And I think, that's like his history. And so like, what's the anxiety when all of this writing starts is to like guard against, we're a small people in a land filled with lots of people. There's the Babylonian exile. There's all this stuff that's happening. And we're potentially going to disagree with this, but writing these texts to create a kind of like preemptive, defense against these accusations. And I suspect that this is very real. This history is very real for Rashi.
Good. Okay. So let me like give another formulation of what
But
I
I'd maybe just accuse Rashi of being like a biblical critic. And
yeah, I doubt it. But but as usual in this group, we can sort of speak that out in through the lens of both sort of scholarly traditions, the critical and the traditional, which is to say that Rashi, and Jody was already taking us here, Rashi has his own tensions and insecurities and probably fear, deep fear of the attack, critique, accusation of the non-Jewish and increasingly Christian-dominated world. And Rashi is maybe not living in the land of Israel, defending the claim of the land of Israel, but is probably conscious of Christian claims against Jews and why Jews had to be superseded, replaced. And one of those is you could look back in the Torah and see the way that the Jews acted in a violent and bloody way and took the land by, you can see that kind of narrative. And I think Lila's saying, and that tells us something about the Torah itself. The Torah itself was written to preempt not just the accusations or claims that Rashi is living with so directly, but the whole history of, as Rashi sees, a whole history of attack and claim and delegitimization of just the existence of Jewishness and certainly the claim to Jewish presence in the Hebrew presence, right, back then in the land of Israel. So you can imagine that Rashi believes that the Torah in its divine, like you're saying that these texts are composed in sort of ex post facto to address concerns, right? Which makes a kind of historical sense. But Rashi's saying something I suspect theologically very bold, which is that the Torah starts knowing that there are going to be these tensions and concerns, and the Torah comes, right? Jody was wondering, why is the Torah so universalistic, Rashi says. And his answer is no, it's particularistic. Torah's our sacred book, and it's worried about us because they're going to attack us and they're going to say we did bad things, right? But, but what? What is our answer? What's our justification? Someone raise your hand if you can answer. What are we going to, Noah? What are we going to say back to the non-Jews who say, you killers, you killed all these people and you took the land by force, Noah?
I think we could say to those people that if we are killers, there's else Midrash that says God gave the chance to give the Torah to all these other nations and they decided it wasn't for them. Israel took God up on the offer and God gave this land to Abraham, who in turn gave it to the rest of the Jewish people, that this is our land. We were promised it, and now we have come to take it and fulfill that divine promise.
Okay, good. The response, the justification is God gave us this land. And by the way, God didn't always God gave you the land first, but then God took it away. God does what God wants. God created the world, right? And this is the sort of the important theological logic here, right? We're heading into the Middle Ages where everything has to be logical. God created the world. God gets to give it to whomever God wants. God gave it to you. You didn't act well. God took it away, gave it to us. But I must say, right, Rashi is living at a time when God has taken it away from us as well, right? Like, there's something in here where Rashi is just acknowledging, I don't know, God does what God wants. Like, we're not there now, are we? And maybe we'll get back there one day, but it's not our violent, like, God is controlling the world. God decides. I've heard people try, in modern, like you see people try to enter into like modern Israeli-Palestinian discourse with this, like, well, God gave us this land. And it's like on either side, well, that doesn't work, like in modern political discourse. But like there's a certain kind of, there's a certain kind of logic that Rashi is trying to bring to the table. And I want to say one other thing, just in case it doesn't get said, and then I'll turn back out to the group. I think it's really important to acknowledge and to see here that Rashi is anxious. Like, by saying the nations of the world are gonna say to us, you stole this. That's like Rashi saying, like, I get that critique. I get that if you look in the Torah, and it's not just you stole the land, you're gonna see some unpleasant things. I get that this is not uncomplicated, and that, like, you know, that maybe I'm not so sure about all of our claims to land, and I'm not so sure about all the ethics, and like, I get that this is complicated, but, right? So just like there's something in Rashi that is not exactly like as kind of absolute, and he concedes part of the case against, even as he is defending it. Okay, let's hear from Rivka. Let's try again. Can we hear from Rivka?
Okay, how is it now?
Great.
Are we better?
Great. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. Let's hear it.
Cool, yeah. So I have a lot of different things to say. I'll try to keep it as short as possible. First of all, I think that, like, one thing we need to understand why we have Bereshit, and I think Rashi knows this, is that the Jews existing was not like was not a thing, right? Like, we didn't, like, Hashem didn't need Jews at first, right? Because he created human beings because, they created human beings because they were lonely, right? And it was through a period of, so all these human beings started existing, and they started futzing around and not doing what Hashem wanted, and eventually we came to Abraham and Sarah, and then again, when we actually received the Torah on Mount Sinai, the Midrash, where the universe was going to blink out of existence if we did not receive the Torah. We all know that one, right? So I think Rashi is mindful of that. That all of this is Hashem's creation, and it's all good. I also think it's really interesting that darkness existed before light. There can be darkness without light.
Okay, well, hold on.
Okay.
I can see you doing another brilliant thought, but let me consider your first brilliant thought, which is, because I think you've done such, you've made such an important move for us, which is to Rivka points out that this is actually a much bigger and better question than it first appears. And the question is, and again, Jody was hinting to this early on, but the question is this a story about the Jews, or is this just a story about the world? And what is the function of Genesis? It's actually not such a bad question if we stop and think about it, because like eventually, very quickly, this becomes the story of Jacob's family. And even then it's like, okay, Jacob's family, but it doesn't really hit until we stand at Mount Sinai, as Rivka said. And then it turns into a tradition. So that's another way of, you could look at it through the sort of the lens of Rashi's very yeshivish, like, what about the law? What about halacha? But it's a bigger question than that, which is, why does the Torah start with cosmos and then consider humanity and then start to focus on one family and one nation and one tradition? What's going on? Why all these things? And we actually all have to think about that. That's a good question. All right, let's try and take some other voices here. I think Alexandra's had her hand up for a while. Or is it still relevant? I'm sorry if it's not.
Oh, I hope it's still relevant. You guys can decide.
No, I'm sorry. I never know when I've come back to a hand that's been raised. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no problem. I sort of have a lot of thoughts that I'm trying to like synthesize into one. So forgive me if this is a little bit of a ramble, but Rashi's idea of the Torah as the law book, I'd like to extend it like the Torah is the book of the principles, not necessarily laws. And if looking at it like that, to me, that this then does make sense about why it's the first, why we start there, because we, like Rashi says, it shows who God is, but it also shows, like, I think, like we learn later on, we're created in God's image, and it shows like the principles for creation. And like what Jamie had said about God speaking creation, I think it's a model for human behavior that God wants us to emulate. Like God doesn't need to speak anything, but I think God is showing us like, this is how you humans create. And like, it's even a risk for God, the creation, like God says, let there be light, and is unsure how it will be until God observes that it's good. And how God speaks the light, but doesn't speak the darkness, and how maybe like, and according to Rashi's point, it's not only showing who God is that gave us Israel, but who the people of Israel are, is that we're people who speak to the light and we create to the light. And yeah, maybe that's where my thoughts end.
Okay, wonderful. And now that we've seen how big the question is, like, what is Genesis up to, in other words? And in some ways, Elizabeth was the first person taking us to this kind of grand perspective. What is Genesis up? Now the answers can start pouring in. And Alexandra is thinking about the way, well, wait a minute, we have to understand, what is God? And what is the nature of God? It isn't, Rashi is saying like, oh, God's the one who created and God's the one who decides. But also like, God's the one who assigns goodness to things. God's the one who, right? Maybe actually now that we think about it, like we start to realize, oh, the Torah wants to establish certain first principles before it heads into our story, because they will be important. And by the way, some of those principles will be that all of humanity is sacred and all of humanity is the creation of God. So what are we going to do with that when we become so important and central to the story? Well, how do we contend with all of it? Now we're starting to see that Rashi's asking like and Rashi's asking a question knowing it's a difficult question. Okay, I think we have time for one more comment, unfortunately, and I have seen Liz and Marlene and David's hands up. So of the three of you, anyone feeling like eager to dive? I have a point right now that I'm seeing Liz. Okay, let's go with Liz.
What really sort of came out to me is this notion of who is the Torah written for? That Rashi's question sort of positions it as a court of law or people who decide. And I think the starting point of Genesis and really the focus of starting at the beginning has a lot to do with who it's for. It's for all of us, as opposed to just the elite, just the rabbis.
Okay, I'm so glad we end with that comment. It's so well put, Liz. And I want to actually answer it somewhat differently than you did your own question. Like, who is the Torah for? Because I think you're saying, and in some sense, the Torah is for everybody, which is true and became true, right? Like the world took on the Torah and couldn't have done so if the Torah had started on this month. This will be the first month, mitzvah number, like that wouldn't have happened. So Liz is right, but I want to say slightly differently, which is that the Torah, in answer to the question, who is the Torah for? Well, wait a minute. The Torah isn't really for everybody. Torah is like Israel's sacred script. So the idea, and this is like a midrashic move, you see this in the midrash a lot, and Rashi echoes it, but stop and think about how absurd it is that the nations of the world, again, let's go to the UN right now and bring this verse from Psalms and say, oh, don't you see? Now, maybe it worked a little better in Rashi's time than because, there was some buy-in to the divinity of this text. But still, the idea that we go back to the nations of the world when they accuse us and say, oh, but if you look at our text, you can see the logic works out and it's all like, as if that matters. As if that matters to the nations of the world, which tells you that on some level, this conversation is internal. The question about how legitimate our claims are is one that we're asking ourselves. And what's the legitimacy of the claims against us is one that we want to defend against because we're really under threat, but we actually have to figure out the right answer to. And in order to do that, we have to get our theology right? So this is happening in Rashi's world, not just in tension with a world outside. So you see how now we've really come to understand Rashi as a person who is standing in a historical moment trying to grapple with the weight of a tradition and figure out how it makes sense of the world that he is living in with all of its tensions and questions. And that's important because Rashi is sometimes seen as a very nitpicky thinker. His next comment will be like Yonatan's, like, what's up with this word right here? right? But Rashi's also a very big picture thinker and is trying to make sense of questions such as, why do we talk about God at all? Right? That's a big question. All right. Looking forward to a year of learning Parshanut with you. It's been great. I'm sorry for the hands I didn't get to today. We'll pick up again next week with Noach. Right?
Thank you, Rabbi. Wonderful. Thank you.
Good to see you all again.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Be
Thank
healthy,
you.
everybody.